An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine by John Henry Newman. Chapter 8. Application of the third note of a true development, assimilative power. Since religious systems, true and false, have one and the same great and comprehensive subject matter, they necessarily interfere with one another as rivals, both in those points in which they agree together, and in those in which they differ. That Christianity on its rise was in these circumstances of competition and controversy is sufficiently evident even from a foregoing chapter. It was surrounded by rites, sects, and philosophies which contemplated the same questions, sometimes advocated the same truths, and in no slight degree wore the same external appearance. It could not stand still. It could not take its own way and let them take theirs. They came across its path, and a conflict was inevitable. The very nature of a true philosophy relative to other systems is to be polemical, eclectic, unitive. Christianity was polemical. It could not but be eclectic. But was it also unitive? Had it the power, while keeping its own identity, of absorbing its antagonists, as Aaron's rod, according to St. Jerome's illustration, devoured the rods of the sorcerers of Egypt? Did it incorporate them into itself, or was it dissolved into them? Did it assimilate them into its own substance? Or, keeping its name, was it simply infected by them? In a word, were its developments faithful or corrupt? Nor is this a question merely of the early centuries. When we consider the deep interest of the controversies which Christianity raises, the various characters of mind it has swayed, the range of subjects which it embraces, the many countries it has entered, the deep philosophies it has encountered, the vicissitudes it has undergone, and the length of time through which it has lasted, it requires some assignable explanation why we should not consider it substantially modified and changed, that is, corrupted, from the first, by the numberless influences to which it has been exposed. Now, there was this cardinal distinction between Christianity and the religions and philosophies by which it was surrounded, nay, even the Judaism of the day, that it referred all truth and revelation to one source, and that the supreme and only God. Pagan rites which honored one or other out of 10,000 deities, philosophies which scarcely taught any source of revelation at all, Gnostic heresies which were based on dualism, adored angels, or ascribed the two testaments to distinct authors, could not regard truth as one, unalterable, consistent, imperative, and saving. But Christianity started with the principle that there was but one God and one mediator, and that he, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, had in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. He had never left himself without witness, and now he had come, not to undo the past, but to fulfill and perfect it. His apostles, and they alone, possessed, venerated, and protected a divine message, as both sacred and sanctifying. And in the collision and conflict of opinions in ancient times or modern, it was that message, and not any vague or antagonist teaching, that was to succeed in purifying, assimilating, transmuting, and taking into itself the many-colored beliefs, forms of worship, codes of duty, schools of thought, through which it was ever moving. It was grace, and it was truth. Section 1. The assimilating power of dogmatic truth. That there is a truth, then, that there is one truth, that religious error is in itself of an immoral nature, that its maintainers, unless involuntarily such, are guilty in maintaining it, that it is to be dreaded, that the search for truth is not the gratification of curiosity, that its attainment has nothing of the excitement of a discovery, that the mind is below truth, not above it, and is bound not to descant upon it, but to venerate it, that the truth and falsehood are set before us for the trial of our hearts, that our choice is an awful giving forth of lots, on which salvation or rejection is inscribed, that before all things it is necessary to hold the Catholic faith, that he that would be saved must thus think, and not otherwise, that if thou criest after knowledge, and liftest up thy voice for understanding, if thou seekest her as silver, and searchest for her as for hid treasure, then shalt thou understand the fear of the Lord, and find the knowledge of God. This is the dogmatical principle which has strength. That truth and falsehood in religion are but matter of opinion, that one doctrine is as good as another, that the governor of the world does not intend that we should gain the truth, that there is no truth, that we are not more acceptable to God by believing this than by believing that, that no one is answerable for his opinions, that they are a matter of necessity or accident, that it is enough if we sincerely hold what we profess, that our merit lies in seeking, not in possessing, that it is a duty to follow what seems to us true, without a fear that it should not be true, that it may be a gain to succeed, and can be no harm to fail, that we may take up and lay down opinions at pleasure, that belief belongs to the mere intellect, not to the heart also, that we may safely trust to ourselves in matters of faith, and need no other guide. This is the principle of philosophies and heresies, which is very weakness. Two opinions encounter. Each may be abstractedly true. Or again, each may be a subtle, comprehensive doctrine, vigorous, elastic, expansive, various. One is held as a matter of indifference, the other as a matter of life and death. One is held by the intellect only, the other also by the heart. It is plain which of the two must succumb to the other. Such was the conflict of Christianity with the old established paganism, which was almost dead before Christianity appeared, with the Oriental mysteries flitting wildly to and fro like spectres, with the Gnostics, who made knowledge all in all, despised the many, and called Catholics mere children in the truth, with the Neoplatonists, men of literature, pedants, visionaries, or courtiers, with the Manichees, who professed to seek truth by reason, not by faith, with the fluctuating teachers of the school of Antioch, the time-serving Eusebians and the reckless, versatile Arians, with the fanatic Montanists and harsh Novatians, who shrank from the Catholic doctrine without power to propagate their own. These sects had no stay or consistence, yet they contained elements of truth amid their error, and had Christianity been as they, it might have resolved into them. But It had that hold of the truth which gave its teaching a gravity, a directness, a consistency, a sternness, and a force, to which its rivals, for the most part, were strangers. It could not call evil good or good evil, because it discerned the difference between them. It could not make light of what was so solemn, or desert what was so solid. Hence, in the collision, it broke in pieces its antagonists and divided the spoils. This was but another form of the spirit that made martyrs. Dogmatism was in teaching what confession was in act. Each was the same strong principle of life in a different aspect, distinguishing the faith which was displayed in it from the world's philosophies on the one side and the world's religions on the other. The heathen sects and the heresies of Christian history were dissolved by the breath of opinion which made them. Paganism shuddered and died at the very sight of the sword of persecution which it had itself unsheathed. Intellect and force were applied as tests both upon the divine and upon the human work. They prevailed with the human, they did but become instruments of the divine. No one, says St. Justin, has so believed Socrates as to die for the doctrine which he taught. No one was ever found undergoing death for faith in the sun. Sun is in the sky. Thus, Christianity grew in its proportions, gaining aliment and medicine from all that it came near, yet preserving its original type from its perception and its love of what had been revealed once for all, and was no private imagination. There are writers who refer to the first centuries of the Church as a time when opinion was free, and the conscience exempt from the obligation or temptation to take on trust what it had not proved, and that apparently on the mere ground that the series of great theological decisions did not commence till the fourth. This seems to be M. Guizot's meaning when he says that Christianity in the early ages was a belief, a sentiment, an individual conviction, that the Christian society appears as a pure association of men animated by the same sentiments and professing the same creed. The first Christians, he continues, assembled to enjoy together the same emotions, the same religious convictions. We do not find any doctrinal system established, any form of discipline or of laws, or any body of magistrates. What can be meant by saying that Christianity had no magistrates in the earliest ages? But anyhow, in statements such as these, the distinction is not properly recognized between a principle and its exhibitions and instances, even if the fact were as is represented. The principle, indeed, of dogmatism develops into councils in the course of time, but it was active, nay, sovereign, from the first, in every part of Christendom. A conviction that truth was one, that it was a gift from without, a sacred trust, an inestimable blessing, that it was to be reverenced, guarded, defended, transmitted, that its absence was a grievous want, and its loss an unutterable calamity. And again, the stern words and acts of St. John, of Polycarp, Ignatius, Irenaeus, Clement, Tertullian, and Origen. All this is quite consistent with perplexity or mistake as to what was truth in particular cases, in what way doubtful questions were to be decided, or what were the limits of the revelation. Councils and popes are the guardians and instruments of the dogmatic principle. They are not that principle themselves. They presuppose the principle. They are summoned into action at the call of the principle, and the principle might act even before they had their legitimate place, and exercised a recognized power in the movements of the Christian body. The instance of conscience, which has already served us in illustration, may assist us here. What conscience is in the history of an individual mind, such was the dogmatic principle in the history of Christianity. Both in the one case and the other, there is the gradual formation of a directing power out of a principle. The natural voice of conscience is far more imperative in testifying and enforcing a rule of duty than successful in determining that duty in particular cases. It acts as a messenger from above and says that there is a right and a wrong, and that the right must be followed. But it is variously, and therefore erroneously, trained in the instance of various persons. It mistakes error for truth, and yet we believe that on the whole, and even in those cases where it is ill-instructed, if its voice be diligently obeyed, it will gradually be cleared, simplified, and perfected, so that minds starting differently will, if honest, in course of time converge to one and the same truth. I do not hereby imply that there is indistinctness so great as this in the theology of the first centuries, but so far is plain that the early Church and Fathers exercised more a ruler's than a doctor's office, doctor meaning teacher. It was the age of martyrs, of acting, not of thinking. Doctors succeeded martyrs, as light and peace of conscience follow upon obedience to it. Yet even before the Church had grown into the full measure of its doctrines, it was rooted in its principles. So far, however, may be granted to M. Guizot, that even principles were not so well understood and so carefully handled at first as they were afterwards. In the early period we see traces of a conflict as well as of a variety in theological elements, which were in course of combination, but which required adjustment and management before they could be used with precision as one. In 1,000 instances of a minor character, the statements of the early Fathers are but tokens of the multiplicity of openings which the mind of the Church was making into the treasure house of truth. Real openings, but incomplete or irregular. Nay, the doctrines even of the heretical bodies are indices and anticipations of the mind of the Church. As the first step in settling a question of doctrine is to raise and debate it, so heresies in every age may be taken as a measure of the existing state of thought in the Church, and of the movement of her theology. They determine in what way the current is setting, and the rate at which it flows. Thus, St. Clement may be called the representative of the eclectic element, and Tertullian of the dogmatic, neither element as yet being fully understood by Catholics. And Clement perhaps went too far in his accommodation to philosophy, and Tertullian asserted with exaggeration the immutability of the creed. Nay, the two antagonist principles of dogmatism and assimilation are found in Tertullian alone, though with some deficiency of amalgamation, and with a greater leaning toward the dogmatic. Though the Montanists profess to pass over the subject of doctrine, it is chiefly in Tertullian's Montanistic works that his strong statements occur of the unalterableness of the creed. And extravagance on the subject is not only in keeping with the stern and vehement temper of that father, but with the general severity and harshness of his sect. On the other hand, the very foundation of Montanism is development, though not of doctrine, yet of discipline and conduct. It is said that its founder professed himself the promised Comforter through whom the Church was to be perfected. He provided prophets as organs of the new revelation, and called Catholics psychici, or animal. Tertullian distinctly recognizes even the process of development in one of his Montanistic works. After speaking of an innovation upon usage which his newly revealed truth required, he proceeds, "Therefore hath the Lord sent the Paraclete, that since human infirmity could not take all things in at once, discipline might be gradually directed, regulated, and brought to perfection by the Lord's Vicar, the Holy Ghost. I have yet many things to say to you, he saith," etc. What is this dispensation of the Paraclete but this, that discipline is directed, scriptures opened, intellect reformed, improvements effected? Nothing can take place without age, and all things wait their time. In short, the preacher says, there is a time for all things. Behold the creature itself gradually advancing to fruit. At first there is a seed, and a stalk springs out of the seed, and from the stalk bursts out a shrub. And then its branches and foliage grow vigorous, and all that we mean by a tree is unfolded. Then there is the swelling of the bud, and the bud is resolved into a blossom, and the blossom is opened into a fruit, and is for a while rudimental and unformed, till by degrees following out its life, it is matured into mellowness of flavor. So too righteousness, for there is the same God, both of righteousness and of the creation. Was at first in its rudiments a nature-fearing God. Thence, by means of law and prophets, it advanced into infancy. Thence, by the gospel, it burst forth into its youth. And now, by the Paraclete, it is fashioned into maturity. Not in one principle or doctrine only, but in its whole system, Montanism is a remarkable anticipation or presage of developments which soon began to show themselves in the Church, though they were not perfected for centuries after. Its rigid maintenance of the original creed, yet its admission of a development, at least in the ritual, has just been instanced in the person of Tertullian. Equally Catholic in their principle, whether in fact or anticipation, were most of the other peculiarities of Montanism. Its rigorous fasts, its visions, its commendation of celibacy and martyrdom, its contempt of temporal goods, its penitential discipline, and its maintenance of a center of unity. The doctrinal determinations and the ecclesiastical usages of the Middle Ages are the true fulfillment of its self-willed and abortive attempts at precipitating the growth of the Church. The favor shown to it for a while by Pope Victor is an evidence of its external resemblance to orthodoxy, and the celebrated martyrs and saints in Africa in the beginning of the 3rd century, Perpetua and Felicitas, or at least their acts, betoken that same peculiar temper of religion which, when cut off from the Church a few years afterwards, quickly degenerated into heresy. A parallel instance occurs in the case of the Donatists. They held a doctrine on the subject of baptism similar to that of St. Cyprian. Vincentius Lyrinensis, says Gibbon, referring to Tillemont's remarks on that resemblance, has explained why the Donatists are eternally burning with the devil, while St. Cyprian reigns in heaven with Jesus Christ. And his reason is intelligible. It is, says Tillemont, as St. Augustine often says, because the Donatists had broken the bond of peace and charity with the other churches, which St. Cyprian had preserved so carefully. These are specimens of the raw material, as it may be called, which, whether as found in individual fathers within the pale of the Church, or in heretics external to it, she had the power, by means of the continuity and firmness of her principles, to convert to her own uses. She alone has succeeded in thus rejecting evil without sacrificing the good, and in holding together in one things which in all other schools are incompatible. Gnostic or Platonic words are found in the inspired theology of St. John. To the Platonists, Unitarian writers trace the doctrine of our Lord's divinity. Gibbon, the idea of the Incarnation, to the Gnostics. The Gnostics, too, seem first to have systematically thrown the intellect upon matters of faith, and the very term Gnostic has been taken by Clement to express his perfect Christian. And, though ascetics existed from the beginning, the notion of a religion higher than the Christianity of the many was first prominently brought forward by the Gnostics, Montanists, Novatians, and Manichees. And while the prophets of the Montanists prefigure the Church's doctors, and their professed inspiration her infallibility, and their revelations her developments, and the heresiarch himself is the unsightly anticipation of St. Francis. In Novatian, again, we discern the aspiration of nature after such creations of grace as St. Benedict or St. Bruno. And so the effort of Sabellius to complete the enunciation of the mystery of the ever-blessed Trinity failed. It became a heresy. Grace would not be constrained. The course of thought could not be forced. At length it was realized in the true Unitarianism of St. Augustine. Doctrine, too, is percolated, as it were, through different minds, beginning with writers of inferior authority in the Church, and issuing at length in the enunciation of her doctors. Origen, Tertullian, nay, Eusebius and the Antiochians supply the materials from which the Fathers have wrought out comments or treatises. St. Gregory Nazianzen and St. Basil digested into form the theological principles of Origen. St. Hilary and St. Ambrose are both indebted to the same great writer in their interpretations of Scripture. St. Ambrose, again, has taken his comment on St. Luke from Eusebius, and certain of his tracts from Philo. St. Cyprian called Tertullian his master, and traces of Tertullian in his almost heretical treatises may be detected in the most finished sentences of St. Leo. The school of Antioch, in spite of the heretical taint of various of its masters, formed the genius of St. Chrysostom, and the apocryphal Gospels have contributed many things for the devotion and edification of Catholic believers. The deep meditation which seems to have been exercised by the Fathers on points of doctrine, the disputes and turbulence yet lucid determination which characterize the councils, the indecision of popes, are all, in different ways, at least when viewed together, portions and indications of the same process. The theology of the Church is no random combination of various opinions, a diligent, patient working out of one doctrine from many materials. The conduct of popes, councils, fathers, betokens the slow, painful, anxious taking up of new truths into an existing body of belief. St. Athanasius, St. Augustine, St. Leo are conspicuous for the repetition in terminis of their own theological statements. On the contrary, it has been observed of the heterodox Tertullian that his works indicate no ordinary fertility of mind, in that he so little repeats himself or recurs to favorite thoughts, as is frequently the case even with the great St. Augustine. Here we see the difference between originality of mind and the gift and calling of a doctor in the Church. The Holy Fathers just mentioned were intently fixing their minds on what they taught, grasping it more and more closely, viewing it on various sides, trying its consistency, weighing their own separate expressions. And thus, if in some cases they were even left in ignorance, the next generation of teachers completed their work, for the same unwearied, anxious process of thought went on. St. Gregory Nyssen finishes the investigations of St. Athanasius. St. Leo guards the polemical statements of St. Cyril. Clement may hold a purgatory, yet tend to consider all punishment purgatorial. St. Cyprian may hold the unsanctified state of heretics, but include in his doctrine a denial of their baptism. St. Hippolytus may believe in the personal existence of the Word from eternity, yet speak confusedly on the eternity of his sonship. The Council of Antioch might put aside the homoousion, and the Council of Nicaea impose it. St. Hilary may believe in a purgatory, yet confine it to the day of judgment. St. Athanasius and other fathers may treat with almost supernatural exactness the doctrine of our Lord's incarnation, yet imply, as far as words go, that he was ignorant viewed in his human nature. The Athanasian Creed may admit the illustration of soul and body, and later fathers may discountenance it. St. Augustine might first be opposed to the employment of force in religion, and then acquiesce in it. Prayers for the faithful departed may be found in the early liturgies, yet with an indistinctness that included the Blessed Virgin and the martyrs in the same rank with the imperfect Christian whose sins were as yet unexpiated. And succeeding times might keep what was exact and supply what was deficient. Aristotle might be reprobated by certain early fathers, yet furnish the phraseology for theological definitions afterwards. And, in a different subject matter, St. Isidore and others might be suspicious of the decoration of churches. St. Paulinus and St. Helena advance it. And thus we are brought on to dwell upon the office of grace, as well as of truth, in enabling the Church's creed to develop and to absorb without the risk of corruption. End of Part 1 of Chapter 8.